Hey guys, in this video we will talk about the Linux kernel. We will look at what it is, what it does, and how it relates to the Linux distributions you might be using. So this video will be the first out of the 3 videos in that new mini video series. This series is the guide I wish I had when I first started learning Linux. In these videos, I will try to use everyday analogies to make sense of the technical stuff and give you the bird's eye overview of how Linux works and the main components of the Linux operating systems without drowning in detail. Within the first 3 videos in this series, we will build a mental framework that will help you to organize Linux concepts, so that next time when you hear a new Linux term, you know where it fits in the grand scheme of things. I was inspired by your comments in response to my recent Wayland video to create this short video series. Thank you so much for your feedback and constructive criticism, as long as we keep it civilized and polite and respectful. It really helps to make these videos better, and I just would like to point out that I'm not a developer. I'm just a regular graduate physics student who uses Linux in my work, but at some point I was a beginner too, and I was very much confused by all the terminology and all the things in the Linux world, so it kind of took me a little while to figure things out. First, let's understand what the Linux kernel is. So think of your Linux operating system as a car. For now, it's of no particular model. We draw it as a plain box. The kernel is like a car engine. It's the powerhouse that makes everything else work. And it's at the core of every Linux distribution. The Linux kernel has several functions. It manages hardware resources like CPU, GPU, memory. It's similar like the engine regulates the fuel. It allows the programs to run and use these resources. When programs want to use the resources, they have to go through the kernel to ask for permission and how much resources they can use. It manages the power usage and is responsible for security and access controls, and a few more functions. We could go deeper into all of this, but this is not the point of this video, which is only supposed to be a high-level overview of the Linux operating system components. Now let's talk about Linux distributions. A Linux distribution, or distro, is like a complete car model. Different car manufacturers or distribution creators start with the same basic engine design, the Linux kernel, but they build different cars around it. Each distribution includes the following components: the Linux kernel, the engine, then we have system software, which includes display server like X11 or Wayland, which we discussed in this video. Then there's also a package management system and a few other components. So these components are like the chassis and the drivetrain of your Linux car. Then we have a user interface. This primarily refers to the graphical user interface, or also called GUI, and also includes desktop environments like GNOME, KDE, XFCE, and Cinnamon. So these would be equivalent to your car interior and dashboard. And finally, we have various applications as part of the Linux operating system. These are the end-user programs like web browser, office suites, media player, games, and many others. And in the car analogy, these will be the accessories like GPS, radio, air conditioning, and so on. But it's worth saying that the lines between these categories can sometimes blur. They're not as rigid. But for now, let's not overcomplicate things. In the remaining 2 videos, we will take a look at the other 3 components of every Linux operating system. Now back to kernel. So here's something to keep in mind. While all Linux distros use basically the same Linux kernel, they might not use the exact same version of the kernel. It's like all gas or diesel powered cars use the same basic design of the internal combustion engine with all common parts. But for example, a 2020 or 2023 model of the same car might have slightly different engine versions, depending on the market that it's going to, or in the attempt to tweak the basic engine design to increase performance. Many distributions also make modifications to the kernel based on specific needs. Some examples of distribution-specific modifications would be Ubuntu adding Ubuntu kernel flavor with specific patches and configurations. Red Hat Enterprise Linux includes additional drivers and features for enterprise hardware. Arch Linux uses more of a vanilla kernel, but with some performance optimizations, where the term vanilla kernel refers to the kernel without any modifications or additional patches. So most Linux distributions try to make their kernel unique and better suited for a particular purpose, while also making sure that it works well with the original unmodified Linux kernel. Now, to sum up, the Linux kernel is a core piece of software that manages basic computer functions. It's the engine of the Linux operating system. Distributions are built upon the kernel to create a complete usable system, just like a complete car model built around the engine to make a fully functional vehicle. Different distributions might use different kernel versions or add modifications to the kernel. Any updates to the basic kernel can benefit all distributions. However, people behind Linux distributions can decide when and how to incorporate these updates. In the next video, we will learn how we get from this engine to the sleek interior and exterior that we use and interact with, where we talk about the display servers and desktop environments.